Have you ever wondered why we so often hide our true feelings from God, presenting only what we think He wants to see? How often do we hold back the parts of us that feel broken or unworthy? C.S. Lewis once remarked, "We must lay before Him what is in us, not what ought to be in us." This is an invitation to be authentic in our relationship with God, allowing Him to see the parts of us we tend to shield. Like a loving parent, God already knows our struggles, yet He waits for us to release them willingly into His care. In times of overwhelming stress or sorrow, it's easy to feel alone in our burdens. But Lewis's words remind us that God does not ask us to bear these alone. Instead, He invites us to bring all of our worries, fears, and pain into His presence. When we do this, we experience the peace that comes from surrender. Dear reader, I encourage you to pause. Take a moment to reflect. What are you holding back? God's grace is big enough to handle all of it. Let us journey together in this freedom, laying our hearts bare before Him and trusting in His unfailing love. Stay with me, for there is more healing ahead. Let us pause to truly reflect on the weight of the burdens we all bear. Life often feels like a journey, one where the path is uneven, and the load we carry grows heavier with each step. These burdens may take different forms. Perhaps it's the overwhelming stress from our daily obligations, the deep grief of losing someone dear, the persistent fear of what lies ahead, or the anxious thoughts that steal our peace and haunt our nights. C.S. Lewis once said, "Hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny." His insight points to a profound truth about suffering. While our burdens are heavy, they are not meaningless. Instead, they are opportunities for transformation. But in the moment, when we are weighed down by these burdens, it's difficult to see this perspective. Much like travelers carrying stones in their backpacks, these burdens gradually pile up, making each step harder. Over time, the load we carry becomes almost unbearable, and we grow weary not only in body but also in spirit. I've been there myself, feeling as though the weight I carried was too much to bear, like trying to ascend a steep mountain with a boulder strapped to my back. It's in these moments that many of us cry out in desperation, wondering how we will continue. Yet, it is often during our lowest points that we experience the profound mercy of God. As Lewis wisely remarked in The Problem of Pain, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. These words resonate deeply, as they remind us that our trials are not without purpose. They are a call to lean into God's grace. Each of us faces these seasons of profound struggle and heartache. They are inevitable in the human experience. However, the key lies not in avoiding these burdens, but in learning how to hand them over to God. Jesus Himself beckons us in Matthew 11, verse 28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." It is this invitation that changes everything. When we surrender our burdens, we are no longer the sole bearers of our pain. Instead, God steps in, offering His strength to sustain us where our strength fails. Consider the idea that, like stones in a backpack, these burdens were never meant to be carried alone. We were designed to journey in faith, to trust that God's hands are strong enough to bear what we cannot. It's easy to feel isolated in our struggles, but Lewis reminds us in The Four Loves that friendship is born at that moment when one person says to another, "What? You too?" I thought I was the only one. The act of sharing our burdens, whether with God or with others, lightens the load. The burdens we carry may not disappear overnight, but our perspective on them can change. We begin to see them not as obstacles, but as stepping stones that bring us closer to God, refining our faith and molding us into the people we are meant to become. Let us then remember that while the journey may be hard, we do not walk it alone. God is with us, lifting the weight and walking beside us every step of the way. In Psalm 38, verse 4, David's words, "My guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy to bear," offer a glimpse into the soul of a man weighed down by his sins and struggles. Despite being a man described as after God's own heart, David wasn't immune to the crushing weight of guilt and pain. His honesty and vulnerability in confessing his burdens resonate deeply with the human experience. We all, at some point, face the overwhelming reality of life's difficulties, whether they are the result of our own actions or circumstances beyond our control. David's confession reminds us of the universal nature of suffering. No one is exempt from the burdens of life. Pain, hardship, and guilt touch every life, often in unexpected ways. This universality is what connects us all as human beings. When C.S. Lewis wrote, "Pain insists upon being attended to." God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone. To rouse a deaf world, he emphasized that suffering, while painful, serves a purpose. It awakens us, calls our attention to something deeper, and invites us to seek God in the midst of it. Just as David's burdens led him to cry out to God, so too do our struggles serve as a reminder of our need for divine intervention. The acknowledgement of our burdens is the first step toward healing. In our modern world, we are often encouraged to suppress our pain, to keep going and not show weakness. But the Bible teaches us the opposite. By admitting that we are burdened, we take the first crucial step toward finding relief. In Psalm 32, verse 3-5, David reflects on the weight of unconfessed sin, saying, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long." His silence, his refusal to admit his burdens, only increased his suffering. But when he confessed, he experienced forgiveness and release. In the same way, we too must recognize and admit our burdens to find the rest we so desperately seek. Jesus offers that rest in a way that no one else can. In Matthew 11, verse 28-30, he invites, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." These words are not just a simple promise, they are a profound invitation to release our burdens into the hands of a Savior who understands them intimately. Jesus' invitation is personal. He doesn't merely offer us rest, he offers us himself as the source of that rest. By coming to him, we find peace not because our circumstances change, but because he offers us his presence in the midst of them. C.S. Lewis, reflecting on this idea, noted, "Look for Christ and you will find him, and with him, everything else thrown in. When we seek Christ, we find not only relief from our burdens, but also a renewed perspective on life itself. Our suffering, once overwhelming, takes on a new dimension. It no longer defines us. Instead, it becomes a vehicle for deeper intimacy with God." As Lewis himself experienced great personal loss and pain, he recognized that surrendering to God in the midst of suffering brought about profound transformation. The burdens we carry, whether guilt, sorrow, or the weight of life's pressures, are not meant to be borne alone. Jesus' invitation to rest is not a promise that life will be free of hardship, but it is a promise that we will never carry our burdens in isolation. In coming to Christ, we are met with compassion, understanding, and a peace that transcends understanding. Philippians 4, verse 6-7 assures us that when we present our requests to God with thanksgiving, his peace will guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. This peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of God's comfort and strength. Gratitude then becomes a vital response to the invitation Jesus offers. When we acknowledge the rest and relief we find in him, our hearts are drawn to gratitude for his guidance and provision. David, even in his darkest moments, never lost sight of God's faithfulness. In Psalm 23, he confidently declares, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." This trust in God's guidance, even through the valley of the shadow of death, reflects a deep-seated gratitude for God's unwavering presence. In our lives, we are continually called to surrender our burdens to God, trusting that he will guide us just as he guided David. This requires humility, the willingness to admit that we cannot carry the weight alone, and faith in God's promise to sustain us. As we release our burdens, we find that God's strength becomes our own. Isaiah 40 verse 31 reminds us, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles, they will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." This promise encourages us to keep trusting, even when the weight feels unbearable. David's story, like our own, is one of burdens and breakthroughs. His willingness to confess, to be honest about his struggles, and to seek God in the midst of his pain serves as a model for us. And just as God guided David through his darkest hours, so too does he guide us today. We can take comfort in knowing that we are never alone in our suffering, that our burdens are not too heavy for God to bear, and that in Christ we find the rest our souls long for. We are reminded of the incredible gift of God's guidance and care. He meets us in our pain, carries our burdens, and invites us into his rest. Through Christ, we are given a place of refuge, a source of peace that transcends all understanding. Let us approach him with gratitude, knowing that he is faithful to guide and sustain us, even in our most difficult moments. In life, we often carry burdens we weren't meant to bear. Our hearts grow weary from the weight of worries, disappointments, and the endless demands of the world. Yet, in these moments of exhaustion, God extends his hand as a shepherd to his flock, gently calling us to rest in his care. The image of God as a shepherd isn't just poetic, it is deeply personal and speaks to the nurturing, watchful, and ever-present nature of God's love. The Bible portrays God not as a distant figure, but as one who walks alongside us, guiding us through life's storms and offering us a refuge when our souls are battered. In Psalm 23, David describes the Lord as his shepherd, someone who leads him to green pastures and quiet waters, restoring his soul. This isn't merely a promise of physical rest, but a profound offer of emotional and spiritual rejuvenation. God's care goes beyond tending to our immediate needs. He seeks to heal the deeper wounds of our hearts, those places where we've become so burdened that we can no longer find peace. His invitation to rest is more than a break from our to-do lists. It is an invitation to lay down our emotional and spiritual burdens at his feet. Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, echoes this shepherd-like invitation, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest," Matthew 11 verse 28. He recognizes our exhaustion, not just from physical labor, but from the heavy emotional burdens we carry: grief, anxiety, guilt, fear. He is aware of our pain, of how deeply we feel life's weight. And it's here that we find one of the most profound truths about God. He wants us to give him our burdens. We don't have to hold on to them, and we don't have to bear them alone. In fact, God's desire to take our worries upon himself is an expression of his love, not a sign of our weakness. The Apostle Peter reassures us of this truth in 1 Peter 5 verse 7, which reads, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." This verse invites us to hand over every fear, every insecurity, every unknown to God because he cares. This is not care in a superficial sense, but in a deeply invested, intimately concerned way. The God of the universe, who crafted the stars and set the planets in motion, is the same God who longs to carry the weight of your personal struggles. What an extraordinary thought! Peter's words remind us that our problems, no matter how small or overwhelming, are of great importance to God. He sees you, and he cares more than you could ever comprehend. C.S. Lewis often spoke of this intimate care and the need for us to trust in God's desire to lift our burdens. He once wrote, "God cannot give us a happiness and peace apart from himself, because it is not there. There is no such thing." In these words, Lewis highlights the reality that true peace cannot exist outside of God's care. We may seek relief in worldly distractions, work, entertainment, or even relationships, but none of these can offer the deep, soul-level rest that only God provides. True peace, true freedom from our anxieties, is found when we surrender them to Him. But often we hesitate. We hold on to our burdens, thinking perhaps they are too trivial to bother God with, or that we should handle them ourselves. Yet this mindset goes against the very nature of God's relationship with us. He is not a distant deity waiting for us to figure things out on our own. Rather, He is a loving Father who desires to be actively involved in every detail of our lives. His care is not conditional, nor is it burdensome to Him. In fact, when we bring our troubles to God, we are fulfilling His very desire for us to live in the fullness of His love, without the chains of anxiety and fear that so often weigh us down. When we trust God as our shepherd, we open ourselves to His protection and guidance. We stop relying solely on our own strength, which is often insufficient, and instead rest in the assurance that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness, 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. This is not an invitation to passivity, but a call to active trust. Surrendering our burdens to God doesn't mean we disengage from life's responsibilities. Rather, it means we engage with them from a place of peace, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. C.S. Lewis also touched on the paradox of surrender and strength in his works. In Mere Christianity, he writes, "Give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life." This is the essence of casting our anxieties on God. It is a daily act of submission, of laying down our plans, fears, and desires, trusting that in doing so, we will find the peace and strength only He can give. Gratitude becomes the natural response to this care. How could we not be thankful to a God who not only created us but continues to care for us with such attention and love? Every burden lifted, every fear eased, every moment of peace is a reminder of His grace. He has guided countless souls throughout history: David, Peter, Paul, and many more, inviting them to rest in Him. And He extends that same invitation to you. Today, take a moment to pause. Reflect on the burdens you are carrying. Are they too heavy? Do they keep you from experiencing the peace God has promised? If so, cast them onto Him. Let the God who shepherds your soul lead you to the still waters of His presence, where you can find true rest. And as you do, may your heart overflow with gratitude, knowing that you are deeply loved and cared for by the One who holds the world in His hands, yet makes time to hold you too. Throughout history, God's deliverance has been a resounding theme, most vividly demonstrated in the story of the Israelites' escape from Egypt. As they cried out under the heavy yoke of slavery, God responded with a promise to lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey, where they would find rest and abundance. This story is more than a historical event. It is a powerful reflection of God's unwavering commitment to hear the cries of His people and provide deliverance. It teaches us that no matter how insurmountable our circumstances may seem, God is always ready to rescue us from our struggles and lead us into His peace. In our own lives, Egypt symbolizes the personal burdens, fears, and challenges that hold us captive, whether it be emotional pain, anxiety, or the weariness of life's demands. The same God who freed the Israelites is still working today, offering us a path out of our personal Egypts, into a place of spiritual rest. God's promise of rest is not confined to the past, it remains active and alive today. Hebrews 4 verse 9 to 11 reminds us of this: there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works. This rest signifies more than physical relaxation. It is the deep peace that comes from trusting in God's plan and surrendering to His will. C.S. Lewis beautifully encapsulates this when he says, "Relying on God has to begin all over again every day as if nothing had yet been done." This daily reliance is an act of faith, acknowledging that God hears our cries and guides us through the storms of life. We may not be fleeing from a literal Egypt, but our personal struggles are no less real, and God's deliverance is no less potent. In moments of despair, we are reminded that His peace is available to us, offering not only rest but renewal. Despite this promise, many of us try to carry our burdens alone, falling into the trap of self-reliance. We live in a world that prizes independence, teaching us to handle things on our own, to solve our problems without asking for help. Yet this mindset can lead to exhaustion as we wrestle with the weight of our struggles. Proverbs 3 verse 5-6 urges us to trust in the Lord with all our hearts and lean not on our own understanding. It's a reminder that self-reliance, though tempting, often leads to burnout. We were never meant to carry the weight of our problems alone, and God does not expect us to. In fact, Jesus Himself extends an invitation to all who are weary, saying, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11 verse 28. Jesus' invitation is profoundly comforting. He does not promise a life free from difficulty, but He offers a way to bear the weight of our burdens without being crushed by them. He invites us to transfer our anxieties, fears, and struggles onto Him, promising that He will help us carry them. C.S. Lewis poignantly reflects on this when he says, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world." Pain and struggle often lead us to a crossroads where we can either continue in self-reliance or surrender our burdens to Jesus. By accepting His invitation, we allow Him to share the weight, to give us the strength to endure what we cannot bear on our own. While challenges remain, they are no longer as heavy, for we walk with the One who offers to carry our burdens alongside us. In this act of surrender, there is profound freedom. 1 Peter 5 verse 7 tells us to cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. It is in recognizing God's care for us that we find the courage to let go of self-reliance and embrace His strength. This doesn't mean our struggles disappear, but they are transformed in the light of God's presence. The same God who parted the Red Sea for the Israelites is the one who makes a way through our own trials, offering the promise of rest in Him. By laying our burdens at the feet of Jesus, we open ourselves to experience the peace that surpasses all understanding. Philippians 4 verse 7. We learn that true rest comes not from escaping life's challenges, but from knowing that God is with us in every step of the journey. God's deliverance is not just about removing us from difficult situations, but about transforming our hearts and minds in the process. As C.S. Lewis once said, "We are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us, we are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be." Even when the road to deliverance seems painful or long, we can trust that God is working all things for our good. Romans 8 verse 28. His promise of peace is not conditional upon our circumstances, but is a gift given freely to those who trust in Him. It is this peace that allows us to face our challenges with courage and resilience, knowing that we are not alone in our struggles. As we reflect on the story of the Israelites and Jesus' invitation to cast our burdens upon Him, we are reminded of the deep gratitude we owe to God. He has not only guided those in need throughout history, but continues to lead us today. His promise of deliverance, rest, and peace is a constant in our lives, offering us hope in times of despair. As we learn to rely on Him more each day, we are transformed by His grace and strength, empowered to live with greater trust and surrender. We can rest in the assurance that no matter what we face, God is faithful to hear our cries and deliver us into His peace. In our journey through life, we inevitably encounter burdens, those moments of heaviness that feel impossible to carry alone. In these moments, trusting God becomes not just a choice, but a necessity. Imagine entrusting Him with something fragile, like a delicate vase in the hands of a master potter. It is in His capable hands that the vase finds stability, and just as the potter carefully shapes his creation, so too does God handle our lives with precision and care. Trusting God with our burdens means giving Him the very things that are too fragile for us to manage, knowing that He alone has the wisdom to carry and reshape them for good. Yet so often we cling to our burdens as though we are the only ones able to carry them. This illusion of control is something many of us struggle with, believing that we must solve our problems through sheer strength or willpower. However, true trust in God involves releasing control entirely. Proverbs 3 verse 5-6 reminds us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight." By trusting God, we acknowledge that His wisdom far exceeds our limited perspective, and when we relinquish control, we open the door for God's divine intervention to take over. One of the clearest metaphors for this trust is the image of a person struggling to hold a boulder over their head. The weight is unbearable, yet they continue to hold it, straining and stumbling under the pressure. Trusting God is like finally allowing Him to take that weight from us, a relief that brings peace and freedom. We were never meant to bear such burdens alone. Jesus invites us in Matthew 11 verse 28, saying, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." This invitation is a powerful reminder that God is willing and ready to relieve us of what we cannot carry on our own. The Bible is filled with examples of individuals who place their trust in God despite overwhelming circumstances. David, for instance, trusted God while fleeing from King Saul, living as a fugitive in constant danger. And yet in Psalm 23 he writes with confidence, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." David's unwavering trust in God's provision and protection is a model for us all, showing that even in the darkest valleys of life we are not alone. Similarly, the Apostle Paul, who faced imprisonment, beatings, and persecution, proclaimed in Philippians 4 verse 13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Paul's strength was not his own, but came from the trust he placed in God's sustaining power. When we trust God, something remarkable happens. Our burdens are lightened. Not necessarily because our circumstances change, but because our perspective shifts. We begin to see our challenges not through the lens of our own limitations, but through the vastness of God's power. Fear and worry dissipate as we remember that we are not the ones in control. C.S. Lewis once said, "Relying on God has to begin all over again every day, as if nothing had yet been done." His words remind us that trust is not a one-time decision, but a daily act of surrender. Each day we choose to place our burdens in God's hands, and in doing so, we find peace that transcends understanding. Faith, too, is intricately tied to trust. When we trust God, we are propelled to move forward, even in the face of uncertainty. Faith is like planting a seed, knowing that while we may not see immediate results, growth is happening beneath the surface. Jesus teaches us that even faith as small as a mustard seed has the power to move mountains. Matthew 17 verse 20. This isn't about the quantity of our faith, but the power of the one in whom our faith is placed. When we trust in God, our small faith can yield extraordinary results, for it is His strength that makes the impossible possible. One of the most beautiful illustrations of this comes from the story of the woman with the issue of blood, Mark 5 verse 25-34. After 12 years of suffering and countless failed attempts to find healing, she reached out in faith, believing that if she could only touch the hem of Jesus' garment, she would be healed. Her faith, though seemingly small, was placed in the right person. Jesus immediately felt power go out from Him and declared to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." This story is a powerful reminder of the transformative nature of faith when it is rooted in trust in God. As we reflect on these examples, we are reminded that trusting God is not about avoiding difficulties or escaping challenges. It is about walking through them with the assurance that we are not alone. As C.S. Lewis poignantly observed, Hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny when we trust God. We are not avoiding the weight of life's struggles, but inviting Him to carry them with us, shaping us in ways we could never imagine. Trusting God with our burdens is an act of faith, one that requires us to surrender control, to let go of our fears, and to place our confidence in His perfect wisdom. It is in this act of trust that we find the relief we long for, the peace that transcends all understanding, and the strength to face whatever lies ahead. And in that trust, we discover a deep gratitude for the one who guides us, the one who holds our lives with the same care and precision as a potter shaping his masterpiece. We are never abandoned. God is always present, ready to take our burdens and guide us through every challenge. In the midst of life's storms, faith becomes the compass that leads us to a peace beyond understanding. As the Apostle Paul reminds us in Philippians 4, verse 7, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This peace isn't bound by circumstances but flows from trust in God's power and goodness. Even in trials, our faith lifts us above the turmoil, offering a new lens through which we view challenges not as insurmountable obstacles, but as opportunities for growth and deeper reliance on God's greater plan. C.S. Lewis, reflecting on suffering, once wrote, "Hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. It's through faith that our burdens are transformed into blessings, reshaping not just our situations but also our hearts." Jesus' invitation in Matthew 11, verse 28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," is a timeless call for those overwhelmed by the weight of life. This rest isn't mere relief, but a soul-deep comfort that comes when we entrust our worries to Him. Faith allows us to let go of the illusion of control and surrender to God's wisdom. Like a mustard seed, even a small amount of faith can move mountains, illuminating the darkest corners of our lives with hope and strength. God's love for each of us is boundless, and He desires to carry our burdens, turning them into pathways of grace. In surrendering, we find not only peace but freedom, walking forward with confidence that God will transform our trials into triumphs. The journey of faith is a call to continually place our trust in Him, knowing that He walks beside us, shaping every hardship into an opportunity for spiritual renewal.